Today, we continue our series on the mysterious world's fairs and their possible connection to the lost empire of Tartaria. In our first installment, we covered many of the eerie similarities of the early world's fairs. If you missed that in video, I encourage you to go back and get the important context and groundwork for the case we will proceed with. We detailed how these magnificent old world buildings were supposedly planned, built, and then destroyed shortly after the fairs, some intentionally and some by mysterious fires. We saw how these masterpieces of architectural design were supposedly slapped up in impossible small time frames. Saw the uncanny similarities in design and intricacy, detailed the official narrative of how these amazing buildings were supposedly made of cheap plaster, and then showed photographic evidence how these official claims do not seem to be believable. All the obvious contradictions to the official narratives have led many to conclude that some of these buildings were in fact there before these world's fairs claimed to have constructed them. Many speculate their origins should actually be traced back to a previous civilization here before we settled America. Many also speculate that civilization was in fact the lost empire of Tartaria. So today we look at Philadelphia's World's Fair, the first official World's Fair in America. It was held in 1876 as the celebration of America's 100th birthday. And what better place to celebrate America's centennial than in Philadelphia, what many consider to be the birthplace of our country, where, of course, the Declaration of Independence was signed. Now, the fair opened May 10th and ran through November 10th, 1876, exactly 6 months. So, let's first lay out the timeline of Philly's World's Fair. On the 4th of July in 1873, just 3 years before the planned opening, the commissioners of Fairmount Park conveyed 284 acres of the park for construction. Exactly 1 year later, to the day, ground was broken, and in just 22 months, all the construction was complete and the fair opened. Now, just use your common sense. That's all I'm really asking you to do. How many times have you traveled a road during a widening project? I'm sure we've all seen this process of widening just one city street take months to a year, and yet we are to believe a 286-acre fair with nearly 200 buildings, along with 16 bridges, 16 fountains, and 5.5 miles of railroad track was completed in under 2. From groundbreaking to opening, the project was completed in just 22 months. Now, the majority of the buildings were supposedly finished 4 to 5 months prior to opening, so the exhibitors had time to set up, which further shortened the already unbelievable 22 months down to 17 or 18. Basically, we are to believe all the groundwork, grading, foundation work, and construction for the 194 buildings was completed in just a year and a half. That's over 10 buildings per month, or one every 3 days or so. A feat that would seem impossible today with modern construction equipment is all but ridiculous to think it was done in 1876 with horses and wagons, or at best a primitive steam shovel maybe. It's no wonder we see the following quote from Thompson Westcott, the author of the Centennial Portfolio, a souvenir book about the fair in 1876. We read, "To the philosophical visitor who looks around and views the beautiful structures which have gone up as if by magic upon this territory, it must be a regret that in a few months they will, as if by magic, disappear. Machinery Hall, Memorial Hall, and Horticulture Hall, rising up in position distant from each other and seeming to have no object in common, will be all that will remain to tell the story of the greatness of this exhibition to succeeding generations. In a few months, as if the wand of Prospero, a character in the Shakespeare play Tempest, were waved over the scene, all will disappear. Our revels are now ended. These are our actors. As I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like their baseless fabric of this vision, the close-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which is inherent, shall dissolve. And like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind." So it's interesting that even those of that time used words like magic in describing how the buildings went up, and then, as if by magic, they disappeared. Then we see terms like actors, spirits even, melted into thin air, and inherited towers, temples, and palaces that simply dissolve without a trace. To believe the official narratives of these World's Fairs, it seems one may need to believe in magic. So let's see exactly what kind of magic Philadelphia provided for the nearly 10 million visitors who came to see the show. Let's first take a bird's eye view of the park. Here we see the 5 main buildings of the expo, Machinery Hall, the main building, also called Industrial Hall, the art gallery, probably more commonly known as Memorial Hall. Then you had Horticulture Hall and the Agriculture Building. Now, of the nearly 200 buildings, which you can see listed here, again, the layout of the park and listing of just under 200 buildings, only 2 remain: Memorial Hall and the Ohio House. Now, others were said to have been moved to other locations, but the majority of the structures were demolished. Here's another aerial view map just to get your bearings. This would be Machinery Hall, the main building, Memorial Hall, Horticulture Hall, and Agriculture Hall. And an actual photo, you see a interesting hot air balloon up there, but Machinery, the main building, that's Memorial, Horticulture, and then Agriculture would be over here. So let's look at some of these main buildings. Here is Memorial Hall today, also referred to as Art Gallery, which is the only of the 5 structures, major structures from that exhibit to survive. Now, it's 365 feet wide and 150 feet tall. Although, I suppose you could add another 12 feet to that, as the structure is said to have another 12 feet below ground level. Could this also be yet another example of a mudflood building? Constructed of granite, brick, glass, and iron. No wood whatsoever used in its construction. Now, atop the magnificent dome stands a statue of Colombia, cast in zinc, the so-called pagan goddess of freedom, the same pagan goddess that stands upon our Capitol building in Washington. Now, just an aside here, Colombia is no goddess. She's merely a derivative of the many pagan father, mother, son occult worship forms born out of Babel, and she is to be considered the very same as many other mother gods such as Isis, Aphrodite, and Venus. Here she is on top of our Capitol building, and also a wider view. Now, Washington is, of course, located in the District of Columbia, aptly named because that district is considered her property, and the states we live in are governed by her. Now, many today are pushing for D.C. to become an actual state, but I'm sure there are many of the cabal that run this country that are probably opposed to lowering her status to that of the same states she rules. Anyway, entry is made by any of the 3 40-foot doors outside, guarded by 2 statues of the mythological beast Pegasus, cast in bronze and accompanied by pagan muses. Here we see the exquisite nature of the interior of Memorial Hall. The interior doors are of iron and bronze, and all the floors are marble. Now, whoever designed this building was obviously a master of his craft. The architect was surely no novice. Or was he? We'll solve that mystery a little later in the video. Here we see a photo of the construction of Memorial Hall. Never mind that the building already looks complete. Never mind the only work that seems to be getting done is landscaping. Its completion date is unclear and sometimes given as the actual opening day of the fair, but that would be impossible, as there would have to be considerable time for the actual exhibits pictured here, including priceless artworks, to be set up and displayed. Most sources say Memorial Hall took just 18 months to complete. Oh, and to be fair, I guess there are others who believe the building was already there long before the World's Fair. Next, we have the main building, or Industrial Hall. We are told this behemoth was one of the temporary structures of the fair. The main building was at the time the largest building in the world by area, enclosing 21.5 acres. So for a 6-month expo, they built the largest building in the world and decided it would just be temporary. It measured 1,880 feet in length. That's over 6 football fields long and 464 feet in width. This is one end, and as you can see how long that building just continues and continues. Now, the superstructure is made of brick, iron, glass, and stone, resting on a substructure of 672 stone piers, on average weighing 2.2 million pounds each. It sure sounds temporary to me. The building contains 35 miles of avenues, transepts, and aisles. Some sources say the building took 18 months to complete, and others have construction time as short as 8 months. It was sold at auction for $250,000 to a private business owner who was basically ran out of business by park officials, as his use for the building, which was various amusements, was deemed beneath its grandeur. It was demolished in 1881, ending its reign as the world's largest building after only a short 5 years. Here we see a picture before the fair, supposedly still under construction. Again, looks constructed to me. Looks like they just needed to landscape the area. Next, we have Machinery Hall, the second largest building in the Exposition, 1,402 feet long, 360 feet wide, covered an area of 14 acres. Machinery Hall took almost 6 months to complete. Next up, Horticulture Hall, 83 feet long by 193 feet wide and 72 feet high, constructed with glass and steel. In other words, a huge greenhouse. Now, this was designed to be permanent, but it fell into disrepair and was demolished in 1955 after supposedly suffering major damage from Hurricane Hazel in October of 1954. Even before the hurricane hit, the hall had been closed to the public due to so-called structural concerns. Horticulture Hall took 9 months to complete. Here are a few pictures of this grand structure. Kind of a creepy one there with this little girl. I don't know what she's doing or pointing at. And the last of the 5 major buildings, here we see Agriculture Hall. Took over 5 months to complete. 5 months. A couple of other pictures here. You can find very few actual images of Agriculture Hall. Here is one. Some part of it kind of does look temporary, but these structures do not. And finally, just a few other of the nearly 200 buildings of the fair, all constructed for a 6-month fair and destined to be demolished and never seen again. One thing I would note is that while some of these buildings are quite magnificent, most of them pale in comparison to other World's Fair buildings. I think the next video in this series will be on the Chicago's World's Fair, and you'll see what I mean. No disrespect to Philadelphia, some of its buildings are absolutely amazing, but I basically chose it mainly because it was considered America's first. This is the English Commission building, one of the buildings that still remain. Again, that's the Ohio House. Shoe and Leather building. Evidently, they needed quite a large facility and quite a magnificent building to display shoes and leather. This was the U.S. government building. It was shaped in the form of a cross. There's the main up and down shaft, and then this goes across. Of course, you can't see the other side. Another temporary building. Judges Hall, quite ornate. This was the American restaurant. So we needed a restaurant. You know, you've got over 10 million people coming, and of course they're going to want to go somewhere to get their corn dogs or their funnel cake. So they just needed to slap a little something up here. Nothing too special to let the people come get their cotton candy and whatnot. This was the women's pavilion. Now, this does look possibly like it was one of the temporary structures there. Let's move on and look at some of the other oddities of the fair. Let's look at a fellow named Herman J. Schwartzman, chief architect of Philadelphia's World's Fair. Now, Schwartzman began working for the Fairmont Park Commission 7 years prior to the fair at age 22 as an assistant landscaping engineer. 22. Assistant landscaping engineer 7 years before the fair. And at age 26, he used his landscaping skills to help with the grounds of the Philadelphia Zoo. Now, somewhere around age 26, a few years before the fair, he was appointed the chief architect for the Centennial Exposition of 1876. designing Memorial Hall, Horticulture Hall, and other buildings. Again, here is Horticulture Hall, the big greenhouse. This was his first ever building he planned and constructed. Not bad for a first effort, wouldn't you say? And this again is Memorial Hall. This is actually opening day. Get the crowd around. Now, remember when we showed the interior pictures of this building and remarked how surely it must have been planned and constructed by a master of his craft? Well, this is Schwartzman's second ever project. Pretty impressive skill demonstrated by a 20-something whose main experience was landscaping. A 22-year-old assistant landscaper sure had come a long way in such a short time. Now, after the fair, Schwartzman attempted to go into private architectural practice, but was unsuccessful in Philadelphia. I guess his skills were just not appreciated. Or he wasn't actually responsible for the design of the structures he was given credit for, and when he attempted his actual own designs, they flopped. I don't know. That is speculation. However, it is perplexing how someone so obviously talented could not make a success of himself in Philadelphia. It is said he did find some success in New York City, and then he died at age 45. Now, if most of the larger structures were already there and he merely had to clean them up, I think his landscaping skills would have been quite adequate. The 18-month time frame given to us to plan, clear, and build the whole of the 286 acres and 200 buildings does not make sense. But that same 18-month time period would suffice to clean up and landscape the area. Again, you are free to come up with your own conclusions. This is Centennial National Bank, built in 3 months in 1876, right outside the fairgrounds as the official bank of the Centennial Exposition. This is the bank that would handle all the money for the fair. Now, immediately, one would notice the bank is a mud flood building, with its first floor windows half buried beneath ground level. Now, I guess they said, there are a lot of buildings here in Philly with windows beneath ground level allowing water to flow in and cause problems. Well, why don't we build our bank the same way? So who was responsible for building this bank? Well, it was Frank Furness, who lived from 1839 to 1912. He designed Centennial National Bank as well as more than 600 other buildings, most in the Philadelphia area. He was one of Philadelphia's best-known 19th century architects. Now, his father was an outspoken Unitarian minister in Philadelphia. Keep that in mind. Nearly 1/3 of his commissions came from railroad companies. Keep that in mind, including the great Broad Street Station seen here, which was a magnificent building demolished in 1953. Interesting. So who was the bank president? Well, that would be Clarence Howard Clark Sr. Now, Clark also bought the Atlantic, Mississippi, and Ohio Railroad, renaming it Norfolk and Western Railway, which still operates today under the name Norfolk Southern. Other deals landed him seats on the boards of the New York, Buffalo, and Philadelphia Railroad and the Railroad Equipment Company. He was an active Unitarian as well. Well, now, I wonder if his pastor was Frank Furness's father. And I wonder if all those railroad buildings old Frank supposedly designed were for Mr. Clark. I've often wondered how all these buildings were divvied up when they were found, and here we just may have a little peek at some of that good old boy system. Now, Clark owned them, but he needed to have an architect who could vouch for when they were constructed. So back to our friend Frank Furness, who designed the bank and a bunch of those railroad buildings for Mr. Clark. Here are several of the buildings Frank Furness was given credit for building. One thing we'll notice is Frank too seemed to have a penchant for designing buildings with, let's say, a certain mud flood flair. Here we see one, obviously your windows coming up to ground level. Here's another, I don't know if you can make those out, a series of windows at ground level. Floors beneath ground level. Windows, doors, whatever they may have been, beneath ground level. Beneath ground level. Here again, windows beneath ground level. And finally, this is a school building I think he built, and more windows beneath ground level. This is actually Frank Furness's gravestone, and we'll take a little quicker look here. Interesting. Seems to be an upside down pentagram on his gravestone. One of the universal symbols for the occult or witchcraft. I'm not sure what this is on the middle, or there's some ornamentation here. Not sure about that, what that may be. Anyone knows? Maybe you could comment. Anyway, just an obviously interesting fellow. Another odd feature of the many of the World's Fairs is that many of these supposedly temporary buildings were moved to other locations after the fairs. Now, this one pictured is from San Francisco's fair that I did another video on. Encourage you to watch. I could find no images of the buildings being moved from Philadelphia's fair, but it is claimed that several dozen buildings from the fair were moved to the then burgeoning New Jersey shore. That's according to a 1976 New York Times story. So who knows, maybe Snooki or JWoww from MTV's Jersey Shore may have visited some of the fair's old buildings. Another oddity. Philadelphia passed an ordinance that authorized Mayor William S. Stokely, pictured here, to appoint 500 men as Centennial guards for the Exposition. Now, I couldn't find any pictures of the guards, but here is one of the buttons on their uniforms. You can see the CG or Centennial Guard. The guards were required to live on site and were housed at 6 police stations strategically located throughout the Exposition. A magistrate's office and courtroom were located at the 2-story police station located on the grounds and was used to conduct prisoner hearings. Officers slept in cramped quarters, which fostered health issues. 8 guards died while working the Exposition. Perhaps this has nothing to do with Tartaria, but I do wonder what kind of prisoners were being held on the fairgrounds that they were having hearings for. Odd indeed. Another point I wanted to make is one of comparison courtesy of Katie from stolenhistory.net. If we compare the area of Philadelphia's World's Fair, pictured here, approximately 286 acres, with that of Disney's Magic Kingdom when it opened, I think 1971, we find that the World's Fair, Philly's World's Fair, was nearly 3 times as large as Disney. Now, both were built in approximately 18 months. How could a fair nearly 3 times the size of Disney be built in the same approximate time frame without the modern construction equipment available to Disney? Some would say that is impossible. Now, if the largest structures of Philadelphia's World's Fair were, say, already there would be no problem. The 18 months of construction time would be plenty to clean up the existing buildings, do some nice landscaping, add a few temporary buildings, again, which I do think some were temporary, and bring in the public for the big show. Once the fairs were over, destroy the evidence, or at least most of the evidence. I don't know. Maybe the official narrative is true. All I can say for sure is that the official narrative seems about as likely as any other theory some label as conspiracy. Now, to wrap things up, let me say I don't think any of my videos on this subject definitively prove anything. We may never know the truth behind all these mysterious World's Fairs and their magnificent architecture. What I can claim is that the official stories we are given are suspect to some degree. To what degree probably depends on how much you trust the people who wrote this history. Some think this is all ridiculous, and if you want to believe in a cover-up and look hard enough, you'll probably find some evidence you can interpret that way. And that may be fair to say. However, I think it is also fair and even fairly logical to question the narrative based on the facts. Facts we are given that in some cases defy sound reasoning. If we are given seemingly impossible construction timelines, have hardly any pictures of the undeveloped sites, hardly if any records of the bids and the blueprints, is it natural or unnatural to question the narrative? If the deeper you dig, you arrive at more questions than answers, perhaps a healthy dose of skepticism is in order. That's kind of where I sit. I'm skeptical of the official narrative, and the normal human response is to ask why. More and more, I liken these World's Fairs to a money laundering scheme. Typically, when money is laundered, it involves a few steps that hide its origins. Once the process is complete, the money is reintroduced into the system with a clean paper trail of where it came from, making it seem legitimate. Now, were the World's Fairs a kind of history laundering scheme? Were steps taken to hide the origins of these buildings? To get rid of some of the buildings, and others were reintroduced with a new history, that they were actually there all along. Instead of money laundering, it's history laundering. And when the process is complete, the new history of the buildings is clean. The buildings they kept have a new history beginning after we arrived in America, and now fit the narrative, and we can all be welcomed into them and be amazed at how marvelous they are. Washing away the history of these old buildings to reinsert them into a new history. Maybe just speculation. Let's look at one more picture of Philly's fantastic fair. That seems to reveal some of our history and perhaps why so many have questions. See a panoramic view of the fairgrounds, but we also notice some imagery up here in the clouds and a good number of people down here. Let's go to the clouds and see what story they may be telling. Hope this is large enough for everyone to see, but it looks like to me you've got some settlers arriving here in America, coming off the boat, and see a couple of Native Americans here, and the settlers seem to be kneeling and very nice to these Native Americans. You got a couple of deer over here that are watching, and they're like, okay, everything looks okay. Interesting though, in the background, it looks like we've already got some big tall buildings back here, and maybe even some over here. But moving along, I guess a little time passes, and then these settlers have decided to give these Native Americans a contract or some sort of deal. Looks like they've got some boxes here, maybe some gold or silver they want to give them for their land. And the deer is now getting out of there. He doesn't seem to think this is a very good deal. But again, we have little indications of these large buildings that are in the background that may have already been there. Well, moving on, now that we've found all these uninhabited palaces, cities, and grand architecture, we don't want to be under the thumb of the British anymore. So the United States want to raise their own flag, kick the British out, which we did in the War for our Independence, and elected our own king, President George Washington. Now, once that little matter was over, we could just head out into the wilderness and start claiming a lot of these cities and these new riches that we have found, again, pictured in the background. Well, what happened next? Well, another little skirmish here. You had the South here who had their buildings that they had found, and you had the North with their buildings, and you had a little disagreement who was going to control them all, and ended up in a civil war. But the good news is, once that was all settled, everybody's back on the same page, and we can do wonderful, amazing World's Fairs like this. Let's take a look at these people down here. Quite interesting. And one of them that kind of jumps out at you is this figure, who seems to be the biggest and closest to the forefront. Let's see what he's got going on. So this mysterious dark figure has got a black trench coat and black top hat. If you do any of the digging into this mystery of these supposedly inherited cities, you'll see a lot of photos with these mysterious men with their top hats. I guess it's kind of interesting that he also has his back hands and back turned, and his hands hidden, so you can't quite see what he's up to there, but he's very prominent up front. Here's another top hat gentleman. He seems to have his back turned as well. And here's another top hatter. We don't quite know who they are. Now, this guy's also got a top hat, and you can see his face, so maybe that blows my theory, but he's kind of odd too. He's got all these lovely ladies behind him. But he seems more interested in this little boy. Kind of odd there. These guys look like a couple of maybe Prussian or European emperors who may be saying to themselves, they should give us more credit. We were the ones who hid the history of Tartaria in the first place. This is quite interesting, this little grouping, so we'll zoom in. This seems to be a military official or general, and he is presenting this kind of a trophy with flowers in it to the goddess Colombia, the bare-breasted goddess of Colombia. I guess this is kind of to represent the giving of the World's Fair, a dedication to her. She doesn't seem too impressed, probably much to the dismay of one of the controllers behind them, who has his hand, of course, inside of his jacket, another universal symbol for involvement with secret societies. And he is overseeing this presentation. And who's beside him? Well, this kind of looks like a Tartarian emperor, maybe. You know, if we maybe zoom in even a little bit closer on him, you see that he's got this shield with him that may indicate where he's from. Now, it's partially obscured by his body and these flowers that are over here, but it seems to be kind of a shade of yellow, and there seems to be a kind of a C-shaped figure over on the right-hand side of the shield. Now, we can't make out the whole thing, so we can only speculate, but I started thinking about the symbols for Tartaria, and what do you know? If you go back and you look at the flags of Tartaria. Their symbol typically was a griffin, and you see this same C-shaped thing on the right-hand side of the flag. There's a C shape, a yellow one. Here's another yellow one with a C shape. Kind of the C shape made from the head of the griffin and the feet moving forward. Very common. So let's go back and see if that could quite possibly be what we're seeing on this gentleman's shield. I don't know. You can make that call for yourself, but that is a quite interesting foursome. Kind of move over here. We see this group of Native Americans. I can imagine they all look kind of dismayed. They're like, how in the world did we let all of this happen? Several other interesting things I picked up on in this picture. Look at these people down here. Now, I don't know if they were depicting African Americans here, but it doesn't seem to be. These people have like glowing eyes and dark demonic faces. And this gentleman does as well with his top hat. I don't know if he's African American. I mean, his hand is white, but his face is this just dark, disfigured, demonic looking face, and almost like he's a young guy courting this non-demonic woman, and this guy's already found his wife and maybe turned her into a demon as well. I don't know. Just extremely odd. This looks like a couple maybe of the Knights Templar or Rosicrucians that are laughing to themselves, kind of hiding behind the tree and saying, our plan is working out perfectly. Here's another one of those mysterious figures back there. Some other interesting people here. It looks like you got a mother who may be introducing her fair damsel daughter to this priest. He must be very important. He's got a big, really big hat. But he has also caught the eye of these two effeminate-looking gentlemen who seem very interested in the priest, much to the mother's dismay, who seems to be giving them a glare. I don't know who might be in this carriage, but not enough information to speculate on there. But this was a very interesting. In the bottom right-hand corner, you got these two guys that almost look like Orthodox priests, and then you have this figure in between, almost like a Christ-like figure. You can make out the hints of a crown. But if you zoom in a little closer, I don't know if you guys can see this through there, but it also has feminine characteristics. It looks like bare breast again. So I don't know if this is one of those kind of nods to the androgyny that's associated with Baphomet, maybe. Right there with in between the two religious figures. Now, I'm sure some of you are going, Trevor, you've lost your mind. You know, you're talking about demons and Baphomet, and this is a picture of the World's Fair, but I don't know. Look at this. What in the world is this? I'll try to zoom in even a little closer. I don't think this is a child. This looks like a goat-faced Baphomet to me. That's not really children's clothing. Again, we got a hidden hand, a goat face, two horns, and what looks like some type of a hat or symbol or star on its head. Now it's kind of in the shadows here even, and smaller than the rest of these figures, so your attention isn't immediately drawn to this figure. In fact, if you back out, you know, you hardly, I don't even know where it is, somewhere right here. So it's not meant to be featured, but if you want to do a little closer look, it's quite evidently there. So I don't know. Maybe my imagination is just run wild. I don't know. But I do hope you'll join me in this journey as we continue to explore the mysterious world's fairs. Next stop is Chicago. Thanks again for tuning in to Quest Logos. I'm J. Trevor Adkins, and until next time, take care and God bless.